This is part 2 of the Mars Hill Audio Journal, Volume 62. I'm Ken Myers. There's a widespread assumption in contemporary culture that science and religion are inherently at odds with one another. Specifically, it's assumed that the conclusions about reality derived from religion are not in keeping with what we learn about the world through scientific means. Science is objective, impersonal, and publicly reliable. Religion is subjective, idiosyncratic, and inherently personal. At best, religion and science are mutually indifferent concerns. At worst, science has disproved religious truth claims, especially Christian claims. That, as I say, is the conventional wisdom, despite the dozens of books written by scientists, philosophers, and theologians that have demonstrated how the disciplines of scientific research and the cosmological assumptions of Christianity are in fact compatible. One of the newest of such volumes is by physicist Stephen M. Barr, called Modern Physics and Ancient Faith. As Barr writes, quote, "The real conflict is not between religion and science, it is between religion and materialism. Materialism is a philosophical opinion that is closely connected with science. It grew up alongside of science, and many people have a hard time distinguishing it from science, but it is not science. It is merely a philosophical opinion, and not all scientists share it by any means." Close quote. Barr says that the basic belief of so-called scientific materialism is that nothing exists except matter, and that everything in the universe is the result of matter and chance. The assertion that science requires such a basic belief is false, Barr argues, and many scientists do not share it. It's a caricature of science to insist on materialism. But there are also caricatures of religion among those who insist on mutual hostility between religion and science. Stephen Barr.
A lot of people who are scientists and hostile to religion or dismissive of religion, I think have a somewhat of a caricature of religion in mind. They think of religion as some kind of pre-scientific attempt to understand the world around us. And they have in mind certain kinds of primitive religions or ancient pagan religions. And they say, just as in ancient times people did not know what lightning was or what thunder was, and so they tended to attribute them to acts of the gods. The thunder and lightning were the ways Zeus manifested his anger, or they didn't know how what volcanoes were or how they operated, and so they made up myths that there were subterranean workshops of Vulcan, the god Vulcan, and that's where the word volcano comes from. So there's this idea that religion is a way of trying to explain the forces of nature that we by people who don't understand the true scientific causes of things. But I don't think that really, that certainly applies to some religions. I don't think that really, there's any evidence that that's really what Judaism and Christianity were ever about. You don't find attempts in the Bible, really. The concern of the Bible is not to explain natural phenomena or to describe them quantitatively or to relate one natural phenomenon to another. The Bible is mostly concerned with the relationship between God and man's relationship, men's relationship to each other. You don't find, I think this idea of the God of the gaps, that's what it's often called. There are gaps in our knowledge of nature, and religion tries to fill those gaps with mythology. I don't think that really is what Judaism or Christianity were ever about. The Bible is concerned with the material world, with the universe, in a very general sense. It says that the universe was created, that all of the order and beauty and magnificence that we see in nature comes from God. So it is concerned with nature in the sense that one of the central themes, obviously, of the Bible is that nature has an author, that there is a creator. And as you say, St. Paul in his letter to the Romans in the first chapter says that even though God himself is invisible, we can know that he exists through the things that he has made. From the very fact that the universe exists, he's arguing, we can know that there is a creator of the universe. And that, but I don't think that the Bible concerns itself with the details of the functioning of the universe. That's not something that the biblical authors showed much interest in, as far as I can tell. The traditional argument for the existence of God, the argument from the fact of creation, is first of all that the mere fact that anything exists at all, the mere fact that there is a universe, calls for an explanation. The fact that anything whatsoever exists. As somebody said, the real question is, why is there something rather than nothing? And that is not something that science can explain. Science can describe what does exist and the regularities that you observe in what exists and the laws that are seen to be obeyed by what exists, but it doesn't explain why anything exists. And the second argument for the existence of God from creation is the fact that the world is so orderly, that there are laws. Traditionally, people would have said, if there's a law, there's a lawgiver. If there's an order to things, somebody imposed that order. That is as valid today as it was in pre-scientific times. In fact, what science has done is shown us that the world is far more orderly, far more intricate in its order, far more magnificent in its orderliness than people realized in ancient times. So if anything, the argument for the existence of God is stronger now than it was then.
One of the areas in which materialist assumptions have been most destructive of Christian conviction concerns the understanding of human nature. For materialists, consciousness, spirituality, and volition are simply electrochemical processes. One section of Barr's book examines recent scientific and philosophical discussions of the nature of the mind.
There are many traditional arguments against the materialist view of the human mind. Some of them go back to Plato and to Aristotle, and have been carried forward into the modern times by very distinguished philosophers like Karl Popper. And in addition, and most of us intuitively sense that there's something inadequate about a completely material view of human beings, that we're just machines. But people have been conditioned in modern times to distrust their own intuitive notions. Or to distrust philosophical arguments, because there's been this notion that science, in its triumphal march, has debunked a lot of common sense views. Things that people used to think were just obvious have been shown to be false. And I think that's a little bit of a simplified view of the history of science, but I don't think it has always debunked, or even for the most part debunked, our fundamental intuitions about the world. And in this case, actually, some of modern scientific discoveries have actually tended to buttress the traditional arguments for the conclusion that the human being is not just a machine. One of the arguments people had against free will was that physics, up until the 20th century, physics was deterministic in character. If you knew the past state of the physical world, you could predict, in principle, you could predict everything that was going to happen in the future. And that seemed to leave no place for human freedom. And then there was a revolution in physics in the 1920s called quantum mechanics, and that, most people agreed, overthrew determinism. Even if you know the complete state of the world at one time, you cannot, even in principle, you cannot predict what is going to happen in the future. And that, many people have said, believed, creates at least an opening for free will. Now, there are attempts, I should say, there are attempts to reintroduce determinism into physics, to modify quantum theory or to reinterpret it in a way that would bring determinism back. But determinism there's no compelling reason to believe at this moment that determinism will come back to physics. And that's not the only way that modern discoveries have sort of buttressed or reinforced the traditional view that man, or the human mind, is more than material. There was a great discovery in the 1930s by a mathematician named Kurt Gödel, G-O with an umlaut, D-E-L, that suggested to many people that there was more to mathematical thinking, to mathematical insight, than the simple following of rules, than simply following out a sort of a mindless manipulations of symbols, the way computers or calculating machines do. Now, Gödel himself was not a materialist, and many people had the sense that from his famous theorem on the nature of mathematics, that you could argue that there was more to mathematics than just blind following of steps, and therefore more to thinking than more to rational thought than just the blind following of steps. This view was then developed by a philosopher named John Lucas in the 1960s. He didn't persuade many people, but he developed this Gödelian argument. And in more recent times, the very eminent mathematician and physicist Roger Penrose has taken up this argument and written some best-selling books on it, one called The Emperor's New Mind, the other called Shadows of the Mind, that argue on the basis of this great discovery of Kurt Gödel that the mind is not just a computer, that there's something more about our minds, at least when we're doing mathematical thinking, that goes beyond the abilities of a simple computer program. Of course, this is very controversial, and Lucas and Penrose have been attacked and from all directions. But they argue very persuasively, it seems to me, and nobody has succeeded really in destroying their argument. So there's another example of an argument from modern discoveries that supports the view that the mind is more than the materialists say it is. There's also an argument from modern physics, from quantum theory again, that the human mind cannot be completely describable by physics. In fact, one of the great physicists of the 20th century, Eugene Wigner, said explicitly, many philosophies are consistent with modern quantum theory, he said, but materialism is not. Another great physicist of the 20th century, Sir Rudolf Peierls, said, the idea that you can describe everything about the human being, including his consciousness and his knowledge, is untenable, he said. There's still something missing. Now, they made these statements based upon the traditional understanding of quantum theory. So there are several discoveries in the 20th century that, at least according to some rather eminent thinkers, undermine the materialist view of the human mind. I suppose we don't have time to go into the details, but I think people should be aware of that. Modern discoveries have debunked a lot of things, and I think one of the things that modern discoveries have debunked is materialism itself. But there's such a strong materialist prejudice in so many quarters that a lot of people have closed their eyes to this, it seems to me.
Stephen M. Barr, professor of physics at the Bartol Research Institute at the University of Delaware, and the author of Modern Physics and Ancient Faith.